Hello? This is an article in The Economist titled The UN's Grim Future. And a little while ago, I was reading speeches by Theodore Roosevelt and Haile Selassie regarding the League of Nations, which was a precursor to the UN. And now we have the successor to the League of Nations, the UN, and its existence for 70 or so years. And here's an article saying that it's in trouble, and I'm reminded of the speeches I read, which were given 80, 90 years ago, and how they have affected the way we think and act today, right? So one thing that I noticed when reading this is, so it starts off with the United Nations has known many crises since its founding in 1945. And with President Donald Trump's return to the White House, there are many traumatic scenarios for the UN. But three stand out: going rogue, decay, and turning Trumpian. I think in the way I was raised, right, the ideas that entered my head as a kid, the UN is supposed to represent this grand collaboration by many nations toward goals which benefit all of them, right? And it is a forum for talking to each other and opening up diplomatic means of communication. It is a way to demarcate and deal with issues between countries, disagreements they might have, so that instead of devolving to war, we might go to something like the UN or a legal body of the UN and agree for them to judge which side is right and which is in the wrong. If we make a treaty between two countries and we can't agree on how this treaty is to be interpreted, then maybe we can agree to a third party interpreting this, The idea of the UN Security Council is that any country which is belligerent towards another, or which is flagrantly in violation of even the most basic concept of human rights, receives pressure from the nations of the planet. And this is good for all those nations of the planet because it protects themselves. The citizens who do not trust their own country have something like the UN, have this grander, greater group of people of the entire world sort of looking out for them. That's one of the ideas behind the American democracy. The argument was that democracy was impossible, and then there was the answer to that given during the founding of the United States of America was that no, if we make democracy big enough, then no one group can take control. So the problem isn't that democracy doesn't work when you get too big. The problem is that democracy doesn't work when you're not big enough. And the UN is supposed to represent some of that issue, supposed to represent those people who, or at least be a voice for those people who do not have a voice of their own, the small people as well as the small countries. If you are an island in the Caribbean and the US is pushing for you to do something that you don't want to do, then there's a lot of pressure there. And how do you find support? How do you strike back? How do you even create a speech that isn't seen as offensive? Well, you do it in the UN, and you base it upon this grander idea of human rights. And this is good for all the nations because it allows them to grow in peace and so on. This is the idea. This is the American view of what the UN should be doing. And that it is this collaboration between the nations of the world, between the peoples of the world, towards a greater ideal. But then you look at something like there is a bit here, right? It says the immediate shock is budgetary. The Trump administration is starving the UN of funds even before it has unveiled its promised view of multilateral institutions. A habitually delinquent member, America has not paid its obligatory UN dues for 2025. The president's budget request for the 2026 fiscal year, coordinating with Congress, pauses almost all payments. Meanwhile, America's foreign aid, much of it routed through voluntary contributions to UN humanitarian organizations, has been slashed. UN agency budgets have shrunk on average by about a third, right? And it turns out that when you look at how the UN operates and what it does, when you look at their activities to, it has a, promote a liberal world order, promote democracy, promote anti-colonialism. For example, it talks about America has stopped funding the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, leaving the Paris Climate Accords, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, Human Rights Council. It has withdrawn from discussions in response to future pandemics, reforming development finance, and protecting part of the high seas. Well, it is leaving the UN, which has, for the most part, followed American ideals in its founding and in its activity. And how do we know it has followed American ideals? Because America has provided the funding. If one country is providing the funding for 1/3 of agency budgets, and in the name of the UN, that seems kind of strange. It's not so much that all the nations of the world are working together to help. It's that a few nations with the greatest money and the greatest resources are giving their money away in the name of something else, right? And there's only two reasons to do that. There's only two reasons to give money away and to give money away and have it be given away under the name of someone else. Either because you wish to do some good in the world, right? And it doesn't matter whose name is on the food given to the starving people who are going through a famine, right? As long as food gets to them. And if you put the UN name on the food packets, then it is easier for people to accept. The government or the fighters or the rebels or the bandits or whoever it is can accept, the UN is helping us feed our people. The world is coming together. It is this great movement. Whereas if it said the US or if it said China on there, then you might be thinking, well, that's the other country trying to influence us, I mean, could you imagine? The U.S. made bombs are blowing up your cities, and then U.S. food is feeding your people. I mean, you're working at cross purposes there, and you're starting to think, okay, I don't care how much food you're giving us, you're bombing us to hell. But if the U.S. bombs are hitting you and the UN is giving you food, then it's much easier to accept that food. It's much less injurious to your pride. Right? So you might do that for good. The other reason you would hide is because you wish to influence the world, but not let it be known that it is you influencing the world. Right? United States of America, is often called a sort of a silent empire. A hidden empire, one which is not colonialistic in the sense that it occupies territory, but is colonialistic in the sense that it directs and controls international movements. It is part of the reason that the high seas are protected. When there is piracy in the straits around Arabia, then you have a few European ships show up, maybe a Chinese ship, and a bunch of American ships. Right? But this is all called a UN movement to protect the openness of the seas. And then what does America have, 7 fleets or something? And so if you wish to hide your power, then you might pretend to be somebody else, pretend to be the UN. But how do you know they're hiding their power? Well, you follow the money. Where is the money going? And today we find something interesting, that the U.S. has in several ways, been growing hostile to the UN and withdrawing its funding. But you would expect that this funding, instead of being withdrawn from the UN and then just dropped completely, would be withdrawn from the UN and then passed again through U.S. agencies, right, with the U.S. name on them to influence the world in a more direct way. Instead, the influence is just not used at all. And we see this action arise. Right? The article mentions 3 scenarios for the UN: going rogue, decay, and turning Trumpian. Going rogue, it says, is something like becoming anti-American, becoming anti-free trade, becoming anti-capitalistic, becoming anti-European or anti-American in its movements, arguing for a change in the way the world is run. And it is unlikely for that change to be for the better, I would think, for most small countries. Because what happens is, as the article points out, this would make it easier for Russia and China to claim leadership at the UN and elsewhere. Right? I mean, you can look at today the troubles in, both Gaza and the Ukraine as issues of states which have gone rogue. States which are members of the UN, but which heartily ignore the wishes and wills of the UN. And why is that? Because, that is because in both cases, one member of the UN, one member of the world, who is a big and strong country, is supporting what's going on here. And in the case of Gaza, you have America supporting Israel. In this case of Ukraine, you have Russia directly moving into Ukraine. And the promise of the UN is blatantly hypocritical in cases like these. It is put together in order to reduce antagonism, reduce fighting to keep the world from going to war. And then members of its Security Council, the most important, the ones who give money to the UN, are going to war. You have China threatening Taiwan constantly, right? And China is the second biggest funder for the UN, but now is also in arrears. So do you have? What happens, right? Do you have some other countries starting to influence the UN and starting to influence international agreements and movements? Do you have countries begin to leave the UN completely and totally ignore it so that it just becomes defunct? And how are any of these results better for something like the United States of America, who has been instrumental in the way the UN functions? And I think you could rightly criticize the UN for not doing its job in many cases. But even if you do that, that doesn't mean that abandoning that job is the right thing to do or the smart thing to do. That doesn't mean that you simply stand there and go, it's too hard to make all these countries do what we want to do, so we're just not going to try at all. We're going to do our own thing. But also, we're going to do our own thing in a way which antagonizes all these other countries who conveniently have a forum for organizing that we are no longer supporting or as influential in, thereby allowing our enemies to direct this organization because we aren't a part of it and we are silent. Right? So, it's one thing to think the UN is ineffective and to leave it, and then for the UN to become unimportant. It is another thing to leave the UN because you think it's effective, and for the UN to remain a system which is effective in some way. right? That would be just giving up power. That would be abandoning it. There's a reason that Russia is still part of the UN, even as it engages in wars. There's a reason that the US is still part of the UN, even as it gets into trouble in Iraq and it engages in a war pretty much on its own terms against the wishes of the general UN body. And as we ask, to what extent are we responsible for this? But then the question also arises, we can argue about America's influence, but at the same time, America is not all powerful. America cannot direct everybody to do exactly as it wants. And America, the United States, changes its mind quite often. Right? We get to what is the purpose of the UN? That's a whole other question that I think Roosevelt sort of pointed out, that, hey, if you aren't part of the world, then you get left behind by the world, because the world is bigger than any one country. So you want to be involved in that system. And the more you try to do it by yourself, the less influence you have on the entire world and the entire system. It says the second scenario is that the UN survives, but the system becomes fragmented and enters decay. Nobody gives it funding. It is starved of abilities and organization, and you have a few things remaining. It mentions the International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Civil Aviation Organization, organizations which are involved in commercial activities, in regulating the safety of atomic weapons, or in regulating, the world's shipping lanes, how the world's planes manage to get around the planet without hitting one another, how to organize radio waves and Wi-Fi wavelengths, and how satellites are placed in orbit so that they don't run into other satellites. That will still exist, but things that attempt to make the world a better place, or activities which are disliked, let's say, by a large and powerful country, will get choked out. The efforts to reduce disease will slowly fade away. Efforts to reduce hunger, efforts to reduce inequality, efforts to have peacekeeping forces preventing conflict somewhere will disappear, and the UN becomes just a sort of paper tiger where people stand up and make loud noises, but these noises are entirely ineffective and do nothing. Right? They don't change the world. They are hit by a single wave, a single trouble, and become wet, weak, fall apart until the paper is reduced to rags. And the UN follows the path of the League of Nations in becoming but a forgotten name and a forgotten idea, only called upon in order to make speeches criticizing and never used in order to praise, where it is completely and totally ignored by large countries who want to ignore it, and then used by those large countries when they decide it is for their benefit, thereby slowly degrading the entire structure of the international system as it becomes a multipolar world where there is no accepted forum because a country cannot be held to its word. And this is what we have today is, America, if America's contributions to the UN are in arrears, and, its contributions, which we already said we would give, That's saying that we have agreed to a debt and now we're not going to pay the debt. That is defaulting on the debt, and that is the worst thing for the country's economic system. And in this case, it is the worst thing for the country's influence. If you can't trust a country to support its own interests year after year, if you look at a country and it is going through paroxysms and struggles and having headaches of its own, and being consumed with its own internal politics and abandoning the outside, then what fills in the gap there? And it is quite possibly nothing. The final scenario, it says, is a Trumpian reinvention. America is wishing to restrict asylum rights under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. It also wants the UN to help strengthen the mission led by Kenya in gang-ravaged Haiti, and has pushed Europe to snap back UN sanctions on Iran. Some countries may welcome a greater focus on peace and less time spent on social matters. So, two thoughts there. One is that America is basically pushing the UN to do things that America wants it to do. And the UN is sort of pushing back on that. And then a question begins to arise. Is the UN pushing back on that because it's a bad idea, because it is an entrenched bureaucracy, or because it is influenced by other interests, and so the UN becomes, instead of a forum for agreement, a simple proxy power struggle between America and China over the next 50 years. Right? The person the country which has more members on certain committees gets to control how the rules are decided, sort of thing, and it becomes a proxy war and a proxy battle for influence. And then we have a problem, because if that is becoming the case, or that is already the case, then the UN has failed as a body. If the UN is capable of, if the UN is dominated by one or two or three powerful interests, and the small interests are doing nothing, which possibly may be the case right now, right? If you just look at funding levels, who actually supports the movement instead of just sends an ambassador? Who gives money back to the UN instead of taking aid from the UN, sort of thing? And if the nations of the world don't want to do that, then what happens? You might have a situation where various movements arise. The BRICS, Pan-African Union, the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, rise up, where these are UN-like bodies, areas where countries come together in order to form agreements, in order to act in concert, but they are more local centers, right? And then you have something like entire continents forming power structures which push back, and groups which have different economic levels forming different power structures. Europe and America have an interest in a certain type of trade. Africa and South America have an interest in a different type of trade as being the most dominant trade. If you are going to push for oil and gas, or you're going to push for renewables, if you think that atomic energy is a good idea or a bad idea, if you think that satellite orbits should change in some way, if you are of the opinion that you should join in the wavelength that China uses for cell phones, then what you have is a splitting up of the world, and that's a question we want to ask ourselves. Do we want the world to become less unified than it is today? It's not perfect at this moment by any means. It could certainly be better, but it could also be much, much worse. And the feeling, at least in the last few years for me, is that it is becoming worse, that countries are trusting each other less, and that even within groups, like even within the EU, you have groups in Europe who don't really mind the invasion of Ukraine, and you have groups in Europe like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, who are going, oh my God, we're going to get conquered again by the Soviets. We have statues, celebrating the fact that we escaped Russian rule, and they're coming right back, and oh my gosh, we're in terrible trouble. And then you have, Poland's worried about that. And then you have, France, Britain going, well, that's a ways away from us. You have Germany going, well, we don't really need to go into debt for that. You have, Hungary and some of the Balkan states going, well, we kind of like the Russian money. And that's just one little situation, one small war in the very edges of Europe causes these activities within the small groups. And how does that happen? That's because small groups are more easily influenced. If you are able to exert influence over 10 states, but you are in the UN and that is a group of 140 states or 200 states or whatever the number is, then that is much less of an issue than if you are a group of 30 states and you can influence 7 of them. Right? So smaller groups are more amenable to influence, which is the democratic theory of the American state. That if democracy is to work, it must be large and composed of disparate groups. No one power can control it, because that leads to instability. That leads to the world going one way, whereas large parts of the planet want to go the other way, and it begins to split up. It's weakened. You can't force it, and that's the real problem of the UN and large organizations like that. You cannot force the world to move in one direction all by yourself. You have to convince them. There may be time periods where, after the world has undergone immense destruction of its resources, a la World War II, and new states are popping up who need support and don't really know what they're doing, that America, the United States, has the ability to just say, do this, we're the most powerful nation on the planet. But that is no longer the case. And chasing a situation which is historically unique, while pretending that, okay, that didn't come out right. I want to say something like, pretending that the unique situation, this goes back to the book on Capital I was reading, right? Pretending that the unique situation we have had for the last 50 years of the world will always be the case, or should always be the case, or must always be the case, is as absurd as thinking that the last 3,000 years of human history say nothing about how countries and people organize. There is a reason that so many states in the history of the planet have been ruled by one person or one small group of people, and oligarchs or nobles or a priesthood or something. The large landowners, the male voters in the polis of Athens who were not women, not slave owners, were actually born in Athens and have citizenship, have the time to take off from work so that they can go to the forum and talk and walk and make decisions, make connections. And the U.S. has sort of acted like that, it feels. Or the U.S. thinks it has acted like that. But we also have the case, those situations never last. And, even we can look at China as an example of, I think, the oldest southern India might also be up here, but we can look at China as an example. One of the oldest continuous civilizations, and that's a nice theory and fact, but when we look at the details, what we see is a succession of empires. What we see is a succession of internal battles. What we see is the 100 States period, and the Warring States period, when there were 100, and there was a time there was 7, and there was another time there was 3. Right, and the various dynasties, and sometimes it's the Mongols, sometimes it's southern China, sometimes it's the Manchurians, and none of these organizations are stable. The world is not stable, even if it remains as a culture. And you look at Greece and Rome and the Byzantine Empire and go, well, even if something lasts 1,000 years, it does not last forever. Cultures change, people change, and most places end up with, massive waves of immigration or changes in technology or colonial adventures happening to them, or causing massive changes in how their states and systems are run. And, the UN is changing. So the question is, how do we change with it? And my general sense is that if the United States is going to step back from the UN, then it needs to replace that influence with something else. It needs to replace that worldwide influence by doing things in its own manner, in its own way. And this is less effective in the UN, because the UN, if you can rope other groups of people into moving along with you, right, then it's much stronger than if you act by yourself and subtly influence people. If you form areas of power and influence, Russia looks at it and says, we have great influence over Eastern Europe and the Middle East. China says we have great influence over all of Asia. The United States says we have great influence over North and South America. And there's this struggle for Africa. We know how that ended up last time. And all of a sudden we end up repeating the mistakes of the past, and it looks suspiciously like the situation it was in 100 or 200 or 300 years ago. And what may end up repeating ourselves again, splitting up into smaller groups, forming together into large ones, splitting up into smaller groups, forming together into a large one. Is this cyclical? It's less clear. It's not quite obvious. And the last little bit I want to go on to, it says here, some countries may welcome a greater focus on peace and less time spent on social matters, which to me is key for words said about human rights and words said about a country's internal struggles. There are countries who say, look, the UN is for agreements between countries, and if we don't want to give, if we, quote, the people in power in our country don't want to give women the right to vote, or if we want to kill all the people of a certain ethnic group, then that is no concern of the UN. The UN is about agreements between countries, and this is an internal country matter, not a human rights matter. And there are countries who would support that and agree with that, but that view also goes against American ideals. That view, which is entirely mercenary, that understands politics as real politic, as power plays, as agreements between dictators and so on, is injurious, I feel, to democracy. One of the great things that the UN can do is recognize countries, is certify that a country which has been on the brink of civil war, which has fallen apart and pulled together, is able to have an election that is free and open and certified by outside observers, and is able to tell the story of togetherness for its people, is able to go to the world and say, we would like some help. The UN doesn't have to always be about sanction busting and about calling people out on human rights. It can be about praising those who have done well. And this is sort of the American ideal. The United States was founded with that understanding that, liberty and justice for all, the pursuit of happiness, the Bill of Rights, these freedoms which are guaranteed to a people, which make them greater, which make life better, which pulls us out of the mire of the past where dictators and kings ruled over all. And the UN is not perfect, but it is better than an empire. We do not want to return to the days of an empire. And it's interesting that, it talks here about, some countries would like other countries not interfere in their local problems, not talk about social issues. But then you have this little statement here: America regards these as creeping world government, reeking of woke ideology, woke gender and climate ideology, and an endorsement of Chinese ideas, right? Well, the question, and it's talking about sustainable development goals, a set of 17 objectives from eliminating extreme poverty to promoting health, that are both utopian and sprawling, right? The UN is an organization which has some goal of eliminating disease, eliminating poverty, lifting the education level of the planet, and America stands against this because it's a creeping world government. Well, if it's a world government doing things America wants to happen, like good education, then you should support that, because it doesn't matter who does it, right? It's that it gets done. It's reeking of woke gender and climate ideology. Well, okay, with climate change, you have this issue of, the entire world is moving in one direction, and do we choose to stop it or halt it? Do we push it or push against it or for it? Do we try to manage it, or do we just ignore it? Do we understand it as an ideology, or do we make an argument about how it should be reacted to? Now, woke gender ideology, and so you end up with the U.S. pushing back against international activities because of U.S. internal politics, because of U.S. views on social issues. Well, then if you're doing that, then you can't also lecture other countries on their human rights issues and their social issues, right? If another country is doing something you don't like, and you have decided that we shouldn't interfere in other countries, then what is the stance you have, right? How do you say that country so and so should do this when you have not allowed country so and so to respond to you in the same way, right? The goal of living, of governing, I would assume, is to make life better for your people, is to pursue a better world and uplift everybody, instead of seeing it as a zero-sum game where we must fall apart or die together. I would say there should be a better way. And the UN, whether it has represented that for a long time, and now as the US falls away from the UN and becomes less favorable towards it, I think it is still unclear to many people in the country of the United States of America why we are doing so. The rhetoric is that the UN is bad or ineffective, but I see some proof it is ineffective. I see very little proof that it is bad. What I see is that when nations of the planet come together and make speeches and have ideologies and have a vision of a better world, whether or not they are working to achieve it, whether or not they are hypocritical, whether or not they are using it as a smokescreen for their real activities, you may look at all the countries of the planet, all the countries involved in the UN, and say that they are all self-serving and bad and hiding behind fancy, nice words. Right? But those fancy, nice words are there for a reason. They're said to influence people. They're said because there's an idea which still feels important, which still riles people up, which still directs the people of the planet to act in a certain way, to imagine a certain world. And as the United States of America falls behind that idea, it is unclear what is to replace it. To have a utopian idea may be foolish, but to have no idea at all is even worse.